Hey folks, welcome back to West Yorkshire Retro Gamer. I just thought I'd have a little talk about the managers that Leeds United have had over the years. Obviously the club officially formed in 1919, albeit Leeds City existed before that. But as far as the official Leeds United are concerned, formed in 1919, and of course have existed up to present day 2025, and long may that continue. So the club have got a list on their official website, as you can see at the top there, and they've listed every manager, which is good. So let's have a little talk about it. Now, these early ones, obviously I have no idea really as to what they've done as such. It's way before my time. I was born in 1984 and started following football from about 1992 onwards. So that just gives you an idea as to where my knowledge, if any, is going to come into play here. So obviously these early ones, there'll always be a space in Leeds United history for Dick Ray, who was the very first person to manage Leeds United. His first stint, not even a full year, albeit maybe that was a full season back then, because there was probably less teams, wasn't there? So that might have been a full season. But yeah, so Dick Ray will obviously always have a place in Leeds United history, being the first official manager of the club. And then you've got a whole list of names: Arthur Fairclough, Billy Hampson, Willis Edwards, Major Frank Buckley, Ray Carter, Bill Lampton, Bob Roxburgh and Jack Taylor. And they basically make up all the full list for quite a period of time there, isn't it? 1919 to 1961. Obviously there was no football played in the war, so I don't know whether some of the early stuff kind of fell within the war maybe. My history's not very good. But certainly covers a big period. And then the first period that probably means the most to some of the oldest Leeds fans that there are in the world. The period managed under the legendary Don Revie. According to this, from March 1961 to July 1974. Now, I could be wrong, but I don't think he was sacked. I think he went to manage England. So I don't think Leeds ever sacked him. Could be wrong though. But I think he left just to go manage England. And then the infamous Brian Clough, who managed the club for one of the shortest periods in the early days. That record has only been beaten in more recent times, when we've had maniacal ownerships. However, obviously Leeds' most successful period, around that time there. And so we then moved down a bit. So after Brian Clough left, Jimmy Armfield came in and managed a fair chunk of time there. Got 4 years in there. He was followed up then by Jock Stein. Jimmy Adamson then took over, and then legendary striker for Leeds United, Alan Clark, managed the team between October 1980 and June 1992. Alan Clark being, one of the highest appearance makers and goal scorers of Leeds United's time. Eddie Gray, another legend from that Revie era. We've got a bracket here of 3 managers that were all players under Don Revie. So, as I say, Alan Clark, October 1980 to June 1982. Eddie Gray, July 1982 to October 1985. He was then replaced by Billy Bremner, the legendary captain of the Don Revie team. Billy Bremner managed Leeds United from October 1985 to September 1988. So I really only remember Leeds United from the Howard Wilkinson era onwards. I'm 41. So I was born in 84 and followed football from about 1992. So by this point, Howard was obviously established himself as the Leeds United manager, and within that time, I have a lot of happy memories. Leeds were just a very good team under Howard, and had some really good players back then. George Graham then took over, and unfortunately, he was there for a couple of years, but the style of play at Leeds became very defensive minded, and it's such a shame with the calibre of attacking player that Graham had at his disposal. But things didn't work out that well, really. And then along came the Champions League days. So 1998 to 2014, the club seems to have bracketed certain periods of time, with grouping the managers here. David O'Leary, who had been a player at Leeds before becoming manager, and that team, between October 98 and June 2002, such a really good, young, vibrant team, full of energy, played out of their skins in the Champions League, reached the semi-final, only to lose heavily to Valencia in the end, which was such a shame. But certainly in my lifetime, aside from winning the final Old English Division 1 before the Premier League was formed, the Champions League run was probably the most successful that Leeds have been. We did reach a League Cup final in, it was either 95 or 96, I think it was 96, where we lost pretty badly to Aston Villa, which was really bad. It wasn't a good performance at all. But to this point, Leeds hadn't really won that much in the modern era. Certainly from where the Premier League was formed, the League Cup final and the Champions League semi-final, to that point were Leeds' two best achievements in the Premier League era. To that point. So yeah, fantastic time being a Leeds fan, seeing O'Leary manage those players. And then it all started going downhill from when Terry Venables took over, really. Financial meltdown. All Leeds fans know exactly what went on around that time. Certainly any Leeds fan that was old enough to remember it. Peter Reid. You see, I didn't mind Peter Reid when he came in, and it was so unfortunate that he literally inherited a shit show in terms of the lack of quality of player that he had at that time. So many of our best players had left, and it was, he was given an impossible task to keep Leeds up. There's not many managers around at the time that would have kept Leeds up. Reid got sacked. Eddie Gray then took the reins to try and keep Leeds up, and he must have been one of the most hurt people around at the time. Given a fairly large chunk of time to try and keep Leeds up, and obviously we stayed up with Peter Reid, but it was like you could tell that things were in dire situations at that point. And Eddie did his best, but by that, even by November, we were in a bad spot, and it was inevitable we were going to get relegated. There was nothing Eddie could do. So then it brought around a very different era for Leeds United. The first time dropping out of the Premier League since the Premier League formed. And it was the job of Kevin Blackwell, the former assistant manager to Neil Warnock for quite some time. This was, I believe, this was Kevin's first senior manager's job. Could be wrong on that one. And within that time, he did get Leeds into the playoffs. And considering that he had to work with virtually a new squad, there was only, from what I can remember, there was only Lucas Radaby and Gary Kelly that stuck around. That were any good. Maybe Michael Dewberry might have done as well, but he was average. But certainly Gary Kelly and Lucas Radaby were, the two experienced heads in the squad. I mean, they were captain and vice captain, I think, under Blackwell, and rightly so. So Blackwell was a little bit unlucky, but the playoff just never happened for Leeds in the end. Really, it was poor, a really poor performance. And at the end of it all, Dennis Wise came in, and we were doomed in a sense, because we got relegated and got given a really heavy points deduction. I remember Dennis Wise talking about how he was trying to ignore the negativity of the relegation and the heavy points deduction, and he talked heavily about making his first signing. I don't know why this sticks in my head, but his first signing was Andy Hughes. And Hughes ended up being a very solid player at that level for us, quite versatile as well. But everyone talks about Dennis Wise with the boggly eyes and all this kind of thing, and he was never the most popular. And a lot of people reckon that his assistant Gus Poyet was the brains behind the moments where Leeds played well, which could be the case. Leeds then decided to take on one of their former legend players of the 90s, Gary McAllister. Great midfielder in his day, really, really good. And unfortunately, it never really worked out. He had virtually a year in charge, and when I say a year, an actual calendar year, as you can see there, January 2008 to December 2008. And I think that part of the reasoning for this was that when Gary came in, he was expected to get a tune out of the Leeds team, and it just never really materialised. Bit of a difficult time to come in and manage a club into if you come in and manage in January, and to them be let go in December you can understand it to a point, in that if you get rid of someone in December and bring someone in December, they get the January transfer window if you have an ownership that will actually support you. So anyway, unfortunately it wasn't a great time as a manager for Gary McAllister. Certainly he'll look back on his Leeds United career with fonder memories as a player than he did as a Leeds manager. At this point, Simon Grayson came in. It was quite difficult to get Simon at the time. I think he was managing Blackpool, and Blackpool really didn't want to lose him. And in the end, Simon Grayson was one of the best appointments that Leeds could have made at that particular time. Joined in December 2008, and Simon was the manager successful in getting Leeds back into the Championship. Within that period of time, December 2008 to February 2012, Simon brought in some really good players for that level. one of my favourite strike forces of all time will always be Jermaine Beckford and Luciano Becchio. The two of them were just such a complete strike force for that level. And in my opinion, there will not be a League One strike force better than those two. I know that in recent times, Birmingham have obviously scored a shed ton of goals in their promotion season and things like that. But for me, there won't be a more complete, two up front strike force than Team Beckford and Becchio. They were brilliant. Similar age as well. Actually similar to me. I think they're both 41 now. I think, just about. Even their birthdays were really close together. Well, they're separated by a couple of months or something. Could be wrong on that. I think it's the case though. Aside from that, we had Gradle and Snodgrass on the wings. Johnny Howson came through the academy and he was bossing the midfield. Richard Naylor, despite spending most of his career at Ipswich, was actually, a Leeds fan and a Yorkshireman. And he came in and got captaincy. Him and Kisnorbo together were a really good defensive partnership. It's a shame that one wasn't together for a lot longer. Even Ankergren, the goalkeeper, wasn't bad. He was decent. I'd say that maybe just fullback was where we were maybe slightly weak, but only slightly. Brad Johnson was capable of a bit of a 30-yard thunder blaster at times, wasn't he? We got Michael Doyle on loan as well, if I remember. He was just your all-out central defensive midfielder. Nothing flashy from him really. He just broke up play and protected the back four. I remember Jason Crowe playing at right back. That's going back a while now. I don't know whether was Fraser Richardson in the squad at that point at right back maybe? He might have moved on since then. I think maybe we had Ben Parker at left back. And if we didn't have him, it were Eddie White. Pretty sure we had one or both of those. So again, more academy players coming through. And I think Neil Redfern might have been the youth, or one of the youth coaches at the time. Could be wrong. I mean, it feels so long ago to me, does this? But good times, and it was such a shame that Beckford ended up having his contract run down and then got his Premier League move to Everton. I mean, he earned it. He earned that chance to manage in the to play in the Premier League, did Beckford. Becchio did stay on, and we needed him to. And weirdly, when Becchio left, he struggled for goals. He just couldn't score. His time at Leeds was, one of the most fruitful times that he ever had in his playing career. A very successful time for Leeds United in terms of getting promoted out of League One. Simon Grayson did a really good job in the end. And then he was replaced by Neil Warnock. This was very controversial. Obviously, Neil Warnock, highly experienced Championship manager. And obviously we'd had Neil Warnock's assistant, Kevin Blackwell, as manager quite a few years prior to Warnock signing for Leeds. He became a little bit more likeable to Leeds fans, I think, when he became manager, but his style of play was not brilliant. And again, he only lasted just over a year. Brian McDermott then came in. I quite like Brian's honesty. He seemed a very upfront kind of bloke and quite likeable. I think he bought a round of drinks for fans when we played a friendly one time or something, if I remember right. And then we went through a bit of a shit show in terms of this period here, the earlier part of this period was very, very poor. So obviously Cellino came in and he appointed Dave Hockaday, one of the least successful managers in Leeds United history. And back when I mentioned about Brian Clough only lasting a very short time, this was the start of where some of these managers didn't, were rivaling that period. It was very, very short. Hockaday, thankfully the club got rid of him quick. He was useless. Came in and said, "Oh, I'm here to coach. I'm a good coach." Like, you couldn't drive a coach, let alone coach a football team. Sorry. The job was way too big for Hockaday. We then moved on to Darko Milanic. Very successful manager in Europe, but was miles out of his depth. Terrible record that he had at Leeds, and again, like Hockaday, a very short time, as you can see there, September to October. Then came in Neil Redfern. Now he steadied the ship. He steadied the ship a little bit. And I remember that Neil promoted a lot of the young players that Leeds had at the time. Sam Byram, right back. Charlie Taylor, left back. Lewis Cook and Alex Mowat, midfield. All four of those featured quite prominently in the first 11. There might have been one or two others as well, but Neil had managed and coached these young players in the Leeds reserves, Leeds under 23s and under 21s, whatever it was back then. So he knew what he was getting with them, and there was a little bit of a low risk. If these kids fail, well, they were kids. If these kids succeed, everyone's happy and it's a masterclass. And he got the team trying to play some decent football. And again, Redfern is a Yorkshireman. He was a Leeds fan. Had a decent career with Barnsley. He was Barnsley capped. I think he captained Barnsley when Barnsley had their short stint in the Premier League. And he'd been at the club. He'd been at Leeds for a little while in terms of being the Leeds youth coach, and it was good that Neil got his chance to manage the first team and to have a bit of a crack at it, and he got the majority of that 14 to 15 season, as you can see there by the dates. And bearing in mind, Neil had to repair the damage that had been caused very early on by Hockaday and Milanic. We were terrible, within the spells that those two had Leeds, and Neil just steadied the ship. They then brought in Uwe Rosler, and he was about as useless as Hockaday and Milanic. Not good at all. Just really poor, and he didn't last, and he left, thankfully. And then came in Steve Evans. Again, Evans was a bit like Warnock, a little bit controversial in terms of some of the stuff that he said about Leeds in the past. Warnock clearly didn't like Leeds. Evans clearly didn't like Leeds. But Evans came in, and again, didn't do a terrible job. He tried to get the team playing some decent football, and again, it just, it was the lack of a promotion that that you could argue that for both Redfern and for Evans, it was the lack of a promotion that ended their time and why they only got roughly one season each. Then came in Trouser Snake himself, Gary Monk. Ugh. Didn't like him. From purely a footballing perspective, he got Leeds very close to a playoff place, and in the end finished 7th, just one place outside of the playoffs, if I remember right. But he was, unlike some of these others that have been on the list recently up to this point, not likeable. Not likeable at all, and I think a lot of people saw right through him. I did. I wasn't fooled by the crap he came out with. And it was only the fact that he had a reasonable season with Leeds that gave him any credibility whatsoever. Absolute trouser snake in the end. Nasty. Then came in Thomas Christensen. Thomas Christensen, I liked him actually. I think he tried to get Leeds playing a reasonable brand of football. Seemed a very likeable guy. In his playing career, he's actually I think he's Danish, or at least Scandinavian, but he actually got capped for Spain. I think he played for Barcelona for a brief time, and it earned him a Spanish cap. But we actually, I think he was managing in Greece when we recruited him. Either Greece or Cyprus. Yeah, we either got him from there or he went there after leaving Leeds. It was one or the other. But he was there from June 17 to February 18. Again, just like we started really well under Christensen. And then it all kind of fell apart a bit. And yeah, it was unfortunate. So Leeds ended up drafting in Paul Heckingbottom, who again, another controversial type of manager, another one that's never really had anything nice to say about Leeds United before. And the football under Heckingbottom was crap. We were destined to finish lower mid-table, bottom half anyway. It wasn't good. Didn't like that at all. And then, by this point, Adria Radrizzani took over from Massimo Cellino, and this was a big turning point. This was a big turning point. And Radrizzani got Angus Kinnear and Victor Orr to pull the boat out and find a manager that was going to be capable of stopping this horrible rot that Leeds were in, where we just could not get promoted from the Championship. And lo and behold, they end up persuading Marcelo Bielsa to come and take over Leeds United in June 2018. It's crazy that it's that far back when we brought the man in, and what a man he is. Just a footballing genius and such a humble man outside of football. Just tremendous. There aren't really words that can be used to kind of describe him. There's been a lot of stuff said before that he was nicknamed El Loco because they call him a bit crazy and things like that. And it's like, no, this guy knew how to bring a brand of football to a club, and to me, he's the best manager out there for improving players individually, and obviously that then results in team success. He took a squad of dirt average Championship level players, and within 2 seasons got Leeds promoted. He just improved these players. These players were average, I'm telling you. They were absolutely average. Marcelo comes in and he just turns them into a proper footballing team. The style of play was just ridiculous. With every team that gets taught to be hard working and to be super fit, you needed a focal point, a flair player that could do, all of the tricks of the trade that you would expect someone like Marcelo Bielsa to thrive managing. And that player ended up being Pablo Hernandez. There were small glimpses from players like Samu Saiz as well, but yeah, Pablo Hernandez just an absolute cut above, and you could see. You could just see that quality connection between Marcelo and Pablo. Obviously, Pablo actually signed before Marcelo came in, but you could just see, like, even Pablo improved his game at that point. He was unplayable in so many games for Leeds in the Championship. He was so good. And it was down, that was down to Marcelo's teachings. It was down to the way that he coached the team. Virtually every player that ever gets interviewed that played under Marcelo at Leeds United, they get asked, what was it like to play under Marcelo? And the majority of them say, not just about what he did for them professionally, but what he did for them personally. He changed them from being footballers to being human beings. He taught everyone humility and the art of being humble. And this was something so rare in modern day football. Very, very rare. Unfortunately, when we did get promoted, again he turned Rafinha into a world-class player. You could already see that Rafinha was very good, but my God, Marcelo just turned Rafinha into an absolute monster. In terms of, Rafinha was the Hernandez replacement almost, in a sense, in terms of that flair and trickery and a little bit of magic on the pitch. And that obviously facilitated a move that Rafinha wanted from the start, and that was for him to get his dream move to Barcelona. And he's just basically been robbed of not winning Ballon d'Or. He really should have had it. He was easily the best player. Ended up coming 5th, God knows how. Stupid voting system. But yeah, this was down to Marcelo Bielsa, who again just got an absolute fantastic tune out of Rafinha, and Calvin Phillips was another player who, I'd seen Calvin come through the Leeds youth ranks, and I said this is going to, I said it, Neil Redfern said it, Calvin Phillips was going to be a good player, and he ended up being a fantastic midfielder for us. Again, Phillips' career has gone downhill since, but at Leeds you can't grumble. You can't grumble with what he achieved and the kind of player he became. So yeah, unfortunately, because Marcelo was unable to kind of stop Leeds getting walloped, we always played the same style, and he was of the opinion that there's only plan A, and you've got to then just try and do plan A better. And this resulted in Leeds suffering quite a few heavy defeats. And this unfortunately came to a very emotional end for Marcelo Bielsa. But if you look at Marcelo Bielsa's career, that length of time, he very rarely stuck at a club for that long. So I think, to me, this was a success. And we, it was just a really nice period of time to be a Leeds fan. In terms of the style of play and just to experience Leeds being managed by Marcelo Bielsa was fantastic. Moving on to Jesse Marsch, this wasn't really a good appointment, was it? He actually got a full calendar year of February 22 to February 23. He was able to keep Leeds up, at the end of the 22 season, but at the end of the 23 3 season, everything was looking pretty bleak, and Jesse Marsh's style of football was not great. We had a couple of nice moments. The 3-0 victory over Chelsea was probably the standout fixture under Marsh's time, I would say. Really good performance that. And obviously Chelsea's manager at the time was Thomas Tuchel, and he's gone on to manage England, but I don't really rate it. So we got rid of Marsh, and then there was the debacle of bringing in Avi Gracia. Started okay, did Gracia, and then something happened. Something happened at half time against Crystal Palace. Pretty sure it was Crystal Palace. And at that point, Gracia, whatever happened in the back at half time, changed the entire situation. And at that point, Gracia just ended up being out of his depth, and he couldn't get a tune out of Leeds at that point. And then there was the extremely financial disaster, if you like, of Sam Allardyce. Offered a huge amount of money to try and keep Leeds in the Premier League, and it was for a matter of about 4 games, and he got about £500,000, and it would have been upgraded to £1 million if he'd kept Leeds in the Premier League. Now, ironically, I didn't actually mind the kind of style of play that Sam Allardyce had brought in at that point, because we'd gone through such a difficult period. Sam Allardyce tried getting Leeds to just go back to getting the basics better. And there were certain moments within those 4 games where Leeds, didn't look terrible, but it was just too little too late. We should, in my opinion, when I look back at it now, if we'd have brought Sam Allardyce in instead of Avi Gracia, and if he'd have had all of that time, I think there was a slight possibility that Allardyce could have kept us up. But you can't expect someone to keep a club up if they're only given 4 games. It was just too unrealistic. So that was that, really. So Big Sam wasn't able to keep Leeds up, and we got relegated. So on relegation, and at this point then obviously Red Rizani sold up to the 49ers, to the York family. So 49ers Enterprises took over, and we started rebuilding. Obviously there was big squad changes, player changes, that kind of thing. Manager changes as well, obviously. And this is where Leeds recruited Daniel Farke. And when you look back at it, it's probably the best appointment that Leeds could have made at that moment in time. When you look at the managers that were available, and you look at managers that were successful at getting teams out of the Championship, and Daniel Farke in the modern day was one of the best available. And he was very unlucky in the first season, losing out in the playoff, but then in the second season won the league with 100 points and scored 95 goals. And Daniel is still the manager today, and doing quite well. 5 games in, we find ourselves in 12th place in the Premier League, and looking pretty good. Defensively sound. The goals are starting to come now that we've scored 3 goals against Wolves in the last match, and this will hopefully give the team a bit of confidence to bag a few more goals as the season goes on. So throughout this period of time, who are the standout managers for me? Let's go back to the beginning. So just to round this off, for me, purely down to the success that he had. I mean, he's seen as a club legend, rightfully so. Don Revier's to be in that list of one of the best managers of all time for Leeds United. Then next it has to be Howard Wilkinson. As I say, he's the last Englishman to win the old top division of English football. There hasn't been an Englishman that's won the Premier League. I'd say Howard's the last English person to win the top division. And as I say, some really good times under Howard. We've number of times that we finished, in the top quarter of the division. It was really, really good. Some really enjoyable times. This was my childhood as a football fan. Was, the first 4 years was under Howard. It was really good. So we'll start with Don, then Howard. I think O'Leary deserves a mention. Again, Champions League semi-final. Good times really. Next then for me, Simon Grayson, being able to get us out of League One, and some of the football that we played at that level was just really, it was really good to watch. We were very dominant in a lot of the games, and as I say, I really enjoyed the strike force that we had in particular at that time. And then Marcelo Bielsa. Again, the man that got us out of the Championship after so long being outside of the Premier League. Could Daniel Farke put himself in a position where he could be, where he could belong in that bracket of, best Leeds managers ever? Getting there. Let's see how he does. Now that he's been given a full whack at the Premier League. Let's see how he gets on in the Premier League with Leeds. If he can keep Leeds up this season, then I think Farke probably has to be put into the equation at that point, because he's won the Championship with some record scores. I mean, some of the wins we got, like we had a 7-0 against Cardiff and 6-0 against Stoke. We absolutely hammered a couple of these teams, really heavily. And really, really enjoyable to watch that kind of thing. And as I say, so far, we've had to change the style of football that we're playing in the Premier League, but that's because we're up against better quality opposition. So for me, it's the jury's out for Farke in terms of whether you put him in that bracket of the best managers that Leeds have ever had. But he's on his way. He's on his way to putting himself there. So, yeah, there we have it, folks. That's my take on every Leeds United manager that's managed the club since its creation in 1919. Probably had more managers than some other clubs, because we've had these couple of periods where, as I say, Clough and Hockaday and Milenik, Gracia, Allardyce. They weren't at Leeds very long. Rossler. They weren't at Leeds very long at all, and because of this, it's meant that Leeds have probably had more managers than they really should have had. Then again, that's down to ownerships, isn't it? You go back to when Bill Fotherby, owned Leeds, and I think he owned Leeds when Howard Wilkinson was in charge, when he was the manager. But then obviously we'd had some horrendous ownerships. Ken Bates, GFH. Ugh, terrible. Cellino. And then Radrizzani kind of steadied the ship. And now obviously the 49ers have come in and have actually seemingly put some proper money into the club. So there we go. Right, I'll leave it there, folks. Big thank you for watching. A bit of a long one, but a good one just to look back at all the managers that have managed Leeds United so far. Do please give the video a like. YouTube is still being a little bit, it's a miss for content creators at the moment, so if you could give the video a like, that would be really appreciated. If you could also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, again, that would be massively appreciated. Big thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.